good longevity lifestyle designers, this is Govin, your secrets of longevity.com. This is going to be a video response to an article that's been making the rounds. It's currently one of the most viewed articles on Salon.com, and it just blew my mind that something that, through reading it and going in depth, making a response to it, first on Facebook and then deciding to make a video on it, it really was concerning to me that so many people share this and it's being such a popular post. But regardless, tying it into previous posts I've made recently on my channel, which I'll link to both of them here, videos on the problems with public health care, and also the video on why free markets result in longer lifespan as compared to higher rates of socialism verging on communism. And if you want to check out either of those, you can do that. And this is just a more general look at communism. The article is called Why You're Wrong About Communism, 7 Huge Misconceptions About It, and then in brackets, End Capitalism. So that is a little bit concerning to me because it's clear upon reading the article that the author doesn't know much about capitalism, and the entire article is built on the premise of a straw man argument, which can be seen just from the picture used in the article to begin with, which is, of course, Karl Marx next to Gordon Gekko from the 1987 film Wall Street, which is great. It's a great movie, but that's a fictional character in the movie, and that is basically taking this character who's purposely created to make something look bad because he's the antagonist in the movie, and using that to try and make him represent capitalism is a straw man argument. I'm not saying there aren't reprehensible characters in real life that have taken on the banner of capitalism, but in all cases they're also taking on the banner of using government force to get their way, which is crony capitalism. That is a huge distinction that needs to be made whenever discussing about capitalism, especially comparing it to communism, and the two are on absolute opposite ends of the spectrum. If you were to look at this image here, you can see that communism is very much low down on the overall state power, and it also leans left. There's definitely other absolute horrific institutions that are very much for state power. They might lean a little bit right, but at the end of the day it's still overarching state power, which inevitably ends up in persecuting people, crushing people's hopes and dreams, and just destroying people's lives, which I'm of course going to give evidence for in this video. Now, had the author been arguing for anarcho-communism versus crapitalism, or I call it crapitalism because it's crony capitalism, you put those words together and that's what you get, then, you know, it would be justified. Now, we'll be briefly touching on the difference between anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-communism, and that will just be through some links that I'll give in a little bit. The overall problem with this entire article is the consistent use of several logical fallacies. Now, I would highly recommend anyone who's going to be interested in going out there and being a writer to really brush up on the difference between authentic, reason-based writing and sophistry, which is just this emotional pushing, emotional-based arguments. And you need to check out link number 2 below. Link number 1 is of course going to be the article that I'm responding to, but link number 2 is a chart depicting the large majority of logical fallacies, cognitive errors, and other things that we can fall into that makes our arguments illogical, essentially, and not valid in any way, shape, or form. So I'd highly recommend anyone brush up on that, whether you're for or against what I'm saying in this video, to actually engage in constructive dialogue, which is what we're all interested in doing, because we want to have our ideas based on facts, not belief systems. But when you base it on a belief system, you come into any kind of discussion with this predetermined bias, and you end up using logical fallacies, which just makes your argument irrelevant. So let's get on with addressing these points. As usual, any links I make will be just numbered in the video, and then you can find the link below for that reference. So the first of the 7 misconceptions that the author claims people have, which there's barely any references given for these misconceptions, they're just the author's perceptions of what he's encountered in his day-to-day life, which is fine. but it's stated as if these are absolutes, when, as far as I can tell in them, a lot of them aren't common misconceptions. And the fundamental misconception rests on the author for not understanding what capitalism is. And I'd argue the same for communism, although it seems that he does know what it is, but he's arguing that its extreme failings are perfectly alright. So state violence exists whether there is a left or right. I think most people realize that. I've never met anyone who doesn't see that issues like police brutality and crackdowns on protests aren't a real thing, and they recognize in today's political environment that happens whether a left or right power is in place. So wherever there's a state, even the smallest amount of taxation is only able to be enforced through the threat of violence. Most people don't actually recognize that. They don't recognize that any kind of law needs to be backed up with the threat of violence if people don't comply. But the author's example of taking someone from their opposite frame of view, and the example was laying claim to one of David Koch's mansions if you just walked in there and tried to squat. So him using police force to get someone out is state violence. And it is state violence insofar that the police are funded by taxpayers' money, but not the fact that he's defending his property. And just as an aside, David Koch, who broke away from libertarianism in 1984, is a full-on Republican. Even if he is open-minded about things like gay rights and ending drug prohibition, he's actually not that big of a statist. So you can't actually project the crony capitalist ideas onto him because he's actually for competition, even though he's in big business, which is interesting. He gets a lot of flack when there's definitely a lot more powerful corporate entities that are trying to eliminate competition through the power of the state, which is crony capitalism. So the first level of self-defense with anyone's property is going to be gates and alarm systems, maybe even security guards, which are all products of the free market. The rights of self-defense of yourself and your property isn't violence, but the defense against violence. The state in most Western countries has a monopoly on law enforcement, and using that to defend yourself against the big four breaches of people imposing themselves against you, which are really the only real crimes because they actually have victims, so that's assault, theft, rape, and murder. It isn't the same as using the state to enforce some law that was set up outside of those four things. A law that you lobbied to have passed to eliminate competition for your business. And so you could more easily grow your business, perhaps get more government funding to allow your business to grow rapidly and once again beat out the competition. So because there's no option for a private police force or a private security that is able to take out and arrest someone that's trying to occupy your property, which is theft, using the state's only available resource for that, because that's all you have available, if it's to defend your fundamental right to private property, that's perfectly legitimate and is not anywhere on the same scale of comparison to the state violence of a communist country that we've seen in the history of human civilization, especially in the 20th century. For the sake of time and a concise as possible video, we're not going to go on a big segue arguing the morality of property rights, but for a better explanation and a greater understanding into whether they're justified or not, link number 3 below is a YouTube video that is discussing the morality there, and also a more in-depth look at anarcho-communism versus anarcho-capitalism, which really the only major difference is property rights, can be found at link number 4 below. And I just saw this video today, it was excellent, and it really summed up the key point that under anarcho-capitalism there's a lot more freedom, and anarcho-communism can exist within it because people can choose to set up small communes, which exists in the world today, even under oppressive regimes that we have in government all over the place. But anarcho-capitalism can't exist under anarcho-communism. So anarcho-communism limits freedom, essentially at its foundation, because it doesn't protect individual rights. It's about collective rights. So in discussing misconception number 2 in the article, I'm going to use a couple quotes here. So the quote, "Most find ourselves constantly stuck between competing pressures and therefore stressed out, exhausted, lonely, and in search of meaning." So not only is this a straw man argument, once again, using an example of people in today's American society and projecting it as an argument against capitalism, which should be an argument against crapitalism, when on a scale of pure free market to all-out statist communism, the U.S. is accelerating towards a much more socialist state that would eventually become statist communism. I'd say it's a bit left of center if we were to draw a line between all-out free market capitalism and all-out oppressive communism. it's inching there, and we can see that in the recent drop, which I covered in one of those videos I had up at the beginning of the recent falling of the U.S.'s economic status by an economic report out of the Fraser Institute. So check out that video for that reference. I don't have that below in this video. But it's pure speculative opinion based on the author's perception of society today, most likely one tainted with a negative fear-based view of the mainstream media. So once again, we're not trying to argue each point ad infinitum, but you can see what the author did here, where they took this idea of people being stressed out in today's society, and because there's some remnants of capitalism from 100 years ago when there was much more free markets going on, and it's actually about 100 years ago, very recently, just last year, that the Federal Reserve came about, and that started to cause government to balloon out of proportion. And yeah, that's when people's stress levels started to go up because they get caught in the daily grind and can never get ahead, and government just keeps taking from them. So another quote from that section is, if you don't think so, try and exit the market. So the market is an extension of the natural world. It's through evolution of morality and ethics, we're able to make it a friendlier environment than the wild. It's a lot more cooperative in a lot of instances than the natural world would be. You can exit the market and live in the world, collecting your own food, hunting, and live much more like our ancestors did before the agricultural revolution, but that's a much harsher life for most people, especially if you don't have the skills to do so. So to suggest that having to provide for yourself through effort is oppressive is idealism. It's like suggesting you have the right to heaven on earth in this very instant because you don't have that available to you. What we do have is oppressive, but what you can do is create the world you want to have around you. You can create a lifestyle. It takes effort, it takes planning, it takes vision, but it's more than possible. Even still to this day, you might have to move out of one of these countries that is rapidly on the decline towards statism, the US, even Canada or the UK. That might have to be something people consider in the near future. But whether your vision is to live in a cooperative type community, that would be like an anarcho-communist type setting, you're free to create that. And there's plenty of options out there for that. Or if you want a nuclear family with a white picket fence, a dog, and 2.3 kids, you can do that as well, as long as you're not doing those things by creating the initiation of force against others. Another quote from the article, The Origin of Capitalism, and that's actually a hyperlink to a Wikipedia page about a book, and was depriving British peasants of their land. So the problem with this is that you can't link to a book that changes the definition of capitalism. I've heard a lot of arguments against capitalism which each have a different definition of it. You can't do that and expect that your argument is going to be taken seriously, while that example of British peasants not having access to their land, that was feudalism. That is the definition of feudalism. If you've never looked that up, I would suggest doing that. And you can't be under a ruling government, a ruling monarch, a ruling anyone, and try to make the claim that that's capitalism. Capitalism is free markets, not crony capitalism, which is corporate control of the markets, not feudalism, which is the monarch control of markets. Don't try and make that argument. It's a straw man argument, which if you were rating your ability to promulgate sophistry on a scale of 1 to 10, we would have to turn the dial all the way up to 11. So these are baseless statements being made to try and prop up the author's ideology. Free markets have their origin in the agricultural revolution. There was definitely trade even before that, but if we were really to take into account when bartering became a real thing, and that eventually led to also using gold and silver in Lydia, and then in Greece is when it was officially a set amount, a set weight, which is where the free markets found their home and expanded and became the markets that we're familiar with today in a rough sense. So another quote from the article, capitalists are compelled to support oppressive regimes and wreck the planet as a matter of business. Once again, I'd argue that capitalism does that. A true free market allows the consumer to vote with their dollar, and it's pretty clear with the acceptance, wider acceptance of the environmental troubles we face today, whether or not they're a direct cause of global warming. There's spills of all types, there's overfishing. All these things are a direct result of government interference. Look at the cod industry of Canada, where cod fishermen, without government oversight, were able to manage for many hundreds of years how they fished and didn't overfish because the entire community believed in keeping that resource sustainable. And then when the government stepped in, from central planning off in some other province, they started to set up quotas and told the fishermen how much they could fish. And because fishermen just went along with that and didn't want to fish less than their counterparts, everyone just started overfishing. And now a resource that was there to the point where you could literally just walk out into the water and pick cod up is completely gone, thanks to government. So the argument against environmental damage is a moral one, not a market one. When the general public agrees that something needs to be done on a larger scale, they vote with their dollar, like I was saying. They can support the most environmentally friendly industries, and that gives financial incentives to corporations to step in line. And by the way, corporations are a creation of government as well. It's a state-created entity that would otherwise have business owners having their own property on the line if they were to screw up. So a corporate entity would be much less likely to do things that were environmentally damaging, because with stronger property rights, people could sue if there was pollution on the land, whether it was through the air or water or the land directly, and they could get money and win as an individual or through a collective lawsuit, and that would eventually, if it bankrupted the company, would cause the owner of the company to end up losing his land too, because he'd be financially tied to it and couldn't be seen as a separate legal entity. And of course, the handouts that government gives is another form of capitalism that you point out is as the author of the article, but you don't separate that from the market. You're saying government handing out money to these businesses is somehow capitalism. It's clear it's not. It involves the government. And the last paragraph in this section about the slave trade and other oppressive things happening and having money involved in them is ridiculous, as this is a clear obstruction of the non-aggression principle, which is foundational to a pure free market system that is what people today actually recognize as capitalism. So in misconception number 3, there's nothing like starting off a paragraph with an appeal to authority type of character attack on the point you're trying to refute. So you can read that section if you want to know the names and what's being said, but it was actually a far greater number than what was said by that media personality of the number of people that were killed as a result of communism. So the macro number of 262 million people in the 20th century died in non-war related deaths directly caused by governments. This is the research of R.J. Rummel. And the large majority of that, roughly 180 million people, were from socialist communist regimes. So even if you were to take out the socialist regimes and just have the pure communist regimes, 160 million people of that 262 million figure is still the majority. Communism killed more people than anything else, diseases and old age not included, in the 20th century. Link number 5 below is a reference for those numbers. And another quote from the article: in declaring this, Gutfeld and his ilk insult the suffering of millions of people who died under Stalin, Mao, and the other 20th century communist dictators. So it is certainly bad journalism to toss out an idea that they died resisting communism to make that number seem more dramatic. But what's actually more disrespectful to these people who died is pushing the ideology that killed them to begin with, while ignoring the fact that whether they agreed with the regime or not is besides the point. They died because of the regime. Just because they were brainwashed to think that it was a good thing at the time doesn't make their death justified. So another quote: famine is not a uniquely left-wing thing. Well, actually, if we start looking at the numbers and doing a bit of research, we can see it's mostly a left-wing thing. And if not just left-wing, it's entirely a statist thing. 30 million people died in the Great Chinese Famine. That's link number 6 below. You acknowledge that, of course. But it is by far the largest famine of the 20th century. So the Great Chinese Famine was caused by social pressure, economic mismanagement, and radical changes in agriculture. Exactly. That's your quote. You just corroborated the point that famine is caused by intervention. Yes, there's small famines that happen from a variety of circumstances, and those were a lot more the famines in the 19th century and such. The next one, 5.5 to 6.5 million deaths in the Soviet Union due to government policy-induced famines. That's link number 7 below. 240,000 to 3.5 million North Koreans died of starvation or hunger-related illnesses in the 90s. That's link number 8. By the way, these are all communist regimes, if you needed to have that acknowledgement. Cambodian famine under Pol Pot caused by city dwellers forced into rural farm work with no knowledge of it, but also forced them to be overworked with inadequate food or rest. 2 million people died total, but there's no numbers that really distinguish between those who died from famine versus direct violence, but the two are often hand in hand anyways. So that's link number 9. So that's all the major cut and dry communist famines. They make up the vast majority of the famines that happened in the 20th century. And by the way, you can't argue the free market caused famines before that, because it basically didn't exist anywhere prior to the 20th century. So of the non-communist major famines of the 20th century, 1.5 to 4 million people died in the Bengal famine caused by wars, which cut off supplies from key countries. Vietnamese famine of 1945 caused by Japanese occupation killed between 400,000 to 2 million people. That's link number 11. Prior one was link number 10. The Biafran famine in the late 60s was caused by war, and the number of million or so people having died was both the famine along with those who had died fighting. There's not a distinguishing number between the two. 2 decades of war, human rights abuses and resettlement, along with a period of low rainfalls, caused 400,000 deaths in the Ethiopian famine. That's link number 13 below. So as you see, those are all war and circumstance-related famines. You could argue that there was capitalism involved there, but really that's colonialism and other sort of oppressive, maybe a little more right-wing regimes starting wars around these countries that causes famines to break out. And they're not a direct result of policy, they're a cause of cutoff of supply in most cases. The only attempt at an argument I've seen of free market economics causing a famine in the 20th century would be the much contested famine during the Great Depression in the US. A recent article that was taken off Wikipedia by a Russian researcher, which is a bit interesting if you look into that whole thing online. It was estimated 7 million people died by this researcher. And academics, unfortunately, now agree that FDR's policies, which were very socialist, exacerbated the depression. It was dragged out much longer than it needed to be without the government's intervention. It was, in the past, thought that his policies actually helped end the depression, but with link number 14 below, clearly shows that. That's a PDF. It's a bit of a long read, but you can also listen to the audio, and it gives very strong evidence to counter the long thought view that Franklin Delano Roosevelt helped matters. He actually exacerbated them. So misconception number 4, capitalist governments don't commit human rights atrocities. So right there, right in the title of misconception number 4, capitalist governments. Colonialism has nothing to do with capitalism, neither does the government. All of this violates the non-aggression principle, and with people actually adhering and morally agreeing with the non-aggression principle, you wouldn't have human rights violations of that type. Let's try to convince, this is another quote, the tens of millions of people who die of malnutrition every year because the free market is incapable of engineering a situation in which less than half of the world's food is thrown away. So that's a really real problem, that so much food is thrown away from grocery stores and whatnot in the restaurant industry. But you've just put the horse before the cart, trying to blame the free market for the fact that people aren't being fed, because that excess food would be a solution to them being fed, doesn't mean that that's the cause of them being malnourished. The problem is in transporting food to those areas. So an excess of food being thrown away isn't the cause of malnutrition. This is a very basic understanding of cause and effect that you need to learn about in this situation. Certainly the food being thrown away is a waste, and we do need to come up with more appropriate uses for it and other ways of dealing with developing world hunger. I'd argue that crony capitalism is a big hindrance to that as well. That's very much an ongoing discussion that would take us on a big segue, which I'm not going to do. So another quote, the 100 million deaths that are perhaps most important to focus on right now are the ones that International Human Rights Organization predict will happen between 2012 and 2030. So if you include future deaths being blamed on capitalism when it's actually crapitalism, you might start getting ever so slightly closer to meeting half the number of deaths that communism caused in the 20th century, but you can't continually keep making this straw man argument to push your points. A free market that emphasizes the value of property rights, which all forms of communism so firmly rejects, deals with the environmental issues much more efficiently than any other theoretical system, but we know the problems with that. And I already talked about this. Property rights result in people actually taking the time to protect their property, and if there's another corporation polluting it, then you have the full right to pursue them in some sort of arbitration or civilian court. Misconception number 5, 21st century American communism would resemble 20th century Soviet and Chinese horrors. So actually it would probably look worse. You tried to make the argument as the author to say that it would be better off just because we have more stuff today. But you completely forget the surveillance state that is already growing around us, and the attempts to surveil every aspect of life and document it, the militarization of police on steroids with all sorts of bizarre technology coming out, being able to fry your nervous system with sound waves, plethora of choices of what to do with dissenters, which would make the gulags look like a vacation. We could shy away from the word communism and just call this new 21st century government that you're proposing the psycho-sociopathic Orwellian Brave New Candy Land of magical mystery, because that's probably what it would end up resembling. Anytime you put a power structure in place, the people that are going to pursue it with the most vehemence are the people with the most damaged psyches in society, the sociopaths, the psychopaths, because they get off on controlling people and hurting them, and so they seek those power systems to cause that pain, and the only way to neuter them is to not have those power systems in place. If you're for anarcho-communism, as you somewhat suggest at the end of this section, then I'd say that's a bit of a better argument for how it could look different, communism in this world. But don't kid yourself about what happens when a government begins to balloon out of proportion in size. Replaying the Middle Ages, that was one of your quotes, trying to suggest that libertarianism would cause the Middle Ages. The best example we have in the modern world of a free market in action were the years after the American Revolution against the British Empire. So from that time up until the early 1900s, before government started ballooning in size, that's when the US became a world superpower, and the engine of that superpower has given it a lot of momentum to carry on through the 20th century. But it was getting slowly turned into a capitalist economy. And to suggest that it's caused as much death and disease and poverty as a feudalist system has is more strawman argument. That's your favorite one to use here, the strawman argument. So misconception number 6, communism fosters uniformity. It does. There's no question about that. For millions of unemployed Americans, this is another quote, try to and are not allowed. Communism envisions a time beyond work when people are free. Well, in history that hasn't been the case, with forced 12-hour work days with no food or breaks. In Cambodia, for instance. And another quote, that so many great artists and writers have been Marxist suggests that the production of culture in such a society would breed tremendous individuality and offer superior avenues for expression. Right, and there was also a lot of art created under the influence of heroin. I don't think that makes it a viable frame of mind for everyone to be in, especially those who are trying to make a living doing more left brain type work. So just believing in something isn't the same as doing it under it. There's not a whole heck of a lot of artists that came out of communist China. Individual thought is rampantly suppressed the bigger the state gets. Also, your vague statement of so many artists is an attempt at using something that needs to be quantifiable, which you have no quantification for, and having that impact on people's minds. So this is more sophistry, this is your manipulation of people's emotions, and you need to learn to make your arguments without doing that if you want to be taken seriously from those of us who have an ounce of rationality in our brains. So misconception number 7 is the other side of the coin. Capitalism fosters individuality, and once again your argument is against capitalism, which I agree with. But pure free market capitalism does foster individuality. It allows for small businesses to compete and even in some cases cooperate, because you always try and throw in that little idea of competition being this horrible thing. No, competition improves products It creates different products so people have a different selection of things to choose from. It creates cheaper products. It creates some more expensive products that might be higher quality. It's crony capitalism that has given rise to the rampant Walmarts of the world. I mean Walmart as well as all the other companies that mass produce things. Funny enough, they produce them in communist China, and the cheaper products that are made there are consumed by the millions of people because they're overtaxed and don't have the means to have the diversity in their life they could have through their choice of products and services that they end up purchasing. Of course, there's still plenty of choice within our current system. You can spend a lot and have a bespoke suit made, or you can spend thousands of dollars on a pre-made but high-quality Armani suit, or you can pay next to nothing and get a low-quality suit that still can look fantastic. And under communism, this would simply not exist in any form. Maybe under the circumstances of anarcho-communism, but it's extremely theoretical. Don't even attempt to bring the housing question into the equation when you're talking about, the things that have sprung up from a housing bubble, which is directly caused by socialist policies in the Federal Reserve. But the housing boom, which results in cookie-cutter type houses, I don't like the look of them. Yes, it's reflective of a bigger problem, which is one of a socialist policy, but have a look at communist housing and try and tell me how that's any better. So do you really think your dear leader would approve of you hanging an ornate tapestry on your wall that was visible from the window, or perhaps putting a nice polka dot curtain in your window in one of those houses? No, you'd be lined up and shot or sent off to the gulags. So I think I made it abundant and clear that this author has next to no reasoning capabilities. He's free to make a response article or video or whatever he chooses to do. As far as I can tell, the best thing I see Jesse Myerson, the author, having going for him is his choice of vests, as I can see from his Twitter profile. But, like I said, rampant strawman arguments, rampant logical fallacies, an inability to distinguish between capitalism and crapitalism, and also playing down the absolutely horrendous atrocities of communism in the 20th century is unforgivable. Well, I'd love to say don't keep contributing this bullshit to the internet and having it be shared successfully, although everywhere I've seen it, people have been making fun of it. That's how I first saw the article. But it just gives us power in shooting down this rhetoric and explaining it to those who actually have a bit of rational thinking capability, and they can see how flagrantly vapid these arguments are, baseless in anything sound and reasonable and containing any critical thought. And I hope that people actually have the courage to drop their belief systems and rise up and see facts for what they are. So let me know what you think about this video in the comments below. Like, favorite, and share the video if you feel so inclined. With that, I'll talk to you next time. Take care and embrace life without limits.